Welcome guys to this opening video on the King's Indian defense. This will be a reasonably short video, an introduction so to speak to one of the most complex openings in chess, so bear with me. It's going to be some pretty fast reruns of some variations, and we'll review some of the most common and critical variations for both white and black players in this opening. And our opening position will be the following. As you know, King's Indian defense, black fianchettos his bishop, and after 4e4 d6, this will be our sort of starting position, even though there are many ways to reach the King's Indian defense. For example, via the fianchetto variation with white, which is very solid. Check that out if you're curious about that. And you like to fianchetto your bishop on the king side, that's a very good option. I will, on the other hand, cover some other variations which are all quite common. I'll try to draw up some arrows for you so you can see. F3, the Sämisch variation, which is a variation you might know from the Nimzo Indian defense, also possible to play here. There's also Knight F3, which was the preference of Kasparov among others. H3, a reasonably new line, or not new, but it's experienced a sort of surge in popularity a couple of years ago when amongst others Yevgeny Tomashevsky played this with great success over a couple of years. You also have some minor lines, including Bishop G5, which has been played by good players in the past, but also the pretty dangerous 4 pawns attack with F4, which is also something we will review quite shortly. I'll start with the Sämisch F3. Many ways for black to counter this move. It all starts with castling, of course. But the real choice for black, after white's most logical move, bishop e3, to strengthen control over the center, is how am I going to counter white in the center now? Am I going to play c5 or e5? e5, as you might know, is the classic way of handling the King's Indian defense with black. So we'll start there. e5 is, however, not the most common line against the Sämisch these days, because white gets a reasonably good position with white after d5. c5 puts white sort of to the test, at least a bit more directly. We'll take a look at that afterwards. Are some couple of moves here for black to try. You could try Knight H5, which was quite popular some years ago, played by John Nunn. For example, Queen D2 is the easiest way to counter this. You could also play Knight E2. Either way, black will play F5. That's the standard way of breaking in the center with black in the King's Indian defense. I mean, the main rule, the golden rule, so to speak, if you follow Nimzovich and his teachings, is to play the same on the same flank as your pawn structure is pointing. So as we can see, this is geared up towards the F4 square and the king side. So F5 is a logical move. The point with this variation for white, though, and the point behind making this development so fast and so quickly, is because white would prefer to actually castle queenside in this variation to avoid any kingside attack from black. So the king is very safe on c1, probably b1 after a couple of moves, very normal move as well. Whilst the black attack on the king side is not going anywhere. So you could easily imagine white tucking away his king in the corner, playing something like rook c1 and going for c5, for example. Could even consider just knight e2, bishop d3 first maybe, to get some development going, and this is looking quite reasonable for white. However, it's still playable for black, as we will see. Knight d7, for example, bishop d3, and you could play something like a6 and go for a queenside attack with a pawn sacrifice. That's also possible. You could go for knight c5, but also knight d f6. Knight e2, f takes e, and if pawn takes, then the g4 square is available for black. So that's nothing to worry about. Knight bishop takes e4 is also possible, but you don't want to give away your bishop. So knight e4 is the way to go. And this kind of position is considered quite safe for white, with a very good control of the e4 square and no tempting pawn breaks for black, at least not in this position. So this is not considered a real test for white. Could go for c6 as well to stop white from castling queenside. And as we can see from these moves, knight h5, still the plan is f5. We can take on f5 and castle. We can just leave it, of course, but taking is also fine, and short castle, and suddenly the position has changed remarkably from the other line. But this is still a nice position for white, but playable for black by all means. Knight d7, something like rook c1, and getting your knight back into the game here, and probably play the knight back to f6 if allowed. So a couple of more moves. a5 to stop b4, of course. f4, e4, and trying to circle back with the knight, and this is looking like a very equal position in the Sämisch. But as I said, e5 is not black's most common move in this position. That is c5. So c5, you don't really want to rush things here. So d5 is of course possible, but there's no need to do it right away. The real question is whether to take the pawn that is available and up for grabs, or to develop with knight e2. So I guess dc5 should be considered, dc, and then taking the pawn on c5 with the bishop. This is playable for white, but is widely considered to be satisfactory for black. However, this requires some theoretical knowledge on black's part. Knight c6, and black's compensation in this variation is connected to control over the dark squares, and especially the d4 square, and surprisingly often the b4 square as well. So this knight on c6 will jump into one of these squares at some point and create havoc and chaos in the center and for white. And white is also lacking in development, so the king and the king's safety is also a concern. Knight e2, b6 is a pretty modern move and a very accurate move as well. You want to gain access to b4 with your knight, so this would be a major catastrophe for white, for example. So bishop a3 is the more prudent move, but then a5 is a real star move, preparing knight b4, and black enjoys tremendous compensation. Even though white is a pawn up and the position might be playable, black should be enjoying compensation here. Knight d5 is a good try, takes, but then knight b4 is still considered to be a fine option for black. In this position, one of white's best moves, I think, is just to accept that the pawn will be lost on a2 and commit to long castle just to get development done, and the game goes on. So this is also a nice line to know. And the key move is, of course, or the key strategy is, of course, these two moves in connection with knight b4. Very important to know with black. If you don't know the right strategy, then white's extra pawn could become very telling very soon. Now let's look at the main line against the Sämisch, which is c5. So c5 is of course very sharp if white goes for knight e2 instead of dc5, which we just considered, which is considered as a slightly more tame but also solid option. A knight e2 keeps more pawns on the board and keeps the tension in the center, so that's considered to be very sharp potentially and strategically. So difficult to handle for both sides. Lots of options here. You could take on d4, you could play queen a5, you could play knight d7. The most normal move is knight c6, again allowing this capture on c5, but the play will be similar to what we just seen, so I will just consider d5. And now knight e5 to threaten the pawn on c4. White goes to g3 with the knight, protecting with the bishop. And now the real question is how to proceed with black here. I mean, you have had some nice active moves with your knight, but there's no obvious way forward. So you have to utilize your pawns and make a break in either the center or the queen side. And to break up the position is not easy here, but the most logical way to do this is e6. Now, white doesn't really want to capture this and allow black more activity in the center. Black could take with the pawn or even with the bishop and pressure this central pawn on c4, so that would be helpful for black. So bishop e2 is white's move. E takes d5, and of course we don't want to take with the e pawn here. I mean, you could, it's an option definitely, and it's been played by some good players as well, but it doesn't really make sense to play e d5 here and allow black pressure in the along the e file, because f3 is such a weakening move here. The bishop on e3 is a bit loose, and it creates unnecessary weaknesses. So c takes d5 is the better move, and it's of course more in alignment with Nimzovich's strategy. Play along the pawn structure and the way that point. So obviously white wants to do something on the queen side, but also f4 is a hopeful move that white wants to make at some point, and preferably continue with e5 to really break in the center and make these pawns telling for white. So black strategy is connected to, of course, the queen side, where black enjoys a pawn majority with 3 pawns against 2, supported by this one, in of course in combination with a potentially very good bishop along this long diagonal. So that's where black wants to open up the position and play. This is the queen side, and white wants to play on the mainly on the king side, but often also maybe play rook b1, b4 to break on the queen side. So lots of plans here, lots of stuff to know. I'll go through some of the more normal moves. After a6, a4 is the only reasonable answer for white. You don't want to allow b5 in one move, so that's something we need to stop. Lots of moves to be considered here in this position. You could go for rook b8 and try to slowly untangle with b5. You could go for h5, h4, try to create some weaknesses on the the white king side, or the king's position here with h3, for example, after kicking the knight, but also just getting some space for your pieces. I mean, h5 castles, and this, for example, would give space for the knight at some point, but also here on h7, so you can play f5, which is a quite common strategy. Bishop d7, however, is the most popular move in the position, because you want to play b5 as soon as possible. h3 is a move here for white to prepare f4, because h3 is covering g4, so the knight cannot go there to harass the bishop. However, castles is of course very safe and very sound, just getting your king to safety on g1. Now, if black is not careful, then f4 will be bothersome after probably preparing it with h3. Then f4 will kick the knight away, and suddenly this guy will have a lack of squares. I mean, there's no square available for the knight on e5 because the bishop is blocking on d7. So this is always a potential problem for black. So b5 must be played. You could take this with white. I mean, it's a pawn after all, ab, and then take the rook, and then bishop takes b5, for example. And as we can see in this position, after the queen a6, protecting the pawn on d6 and threatening the knight, knight a3, knight c3 is not good because rook b8 and knight c4 is just a massive initiative for black. Of course white is the pawn up, but black is having all the fun here, so don't allow that. Knight a3 to cover this square. Still rook b8, and this should be pretty okay for black. Queen c2 will keep the pawn for now, but again black is having all the enjoyment here in this position. Maybe even c4 could be played to get the knight to d3. Lots of options when your pieces are active, such as in this case. So this is not considered to be a testing move, this AB capture. No, very often you play h3 here with white to kick the knight away, and here you have lots of moves to play with black. Knight c4, rook b8, you could go for rook e8, b4 has been played. Lots of different options, but every move must be in conjunction with a plan to counter this f4 break from white f4 to of course kick the knight away from e5. So that's some of the lines in this main line. Instead of castles, h3 is also a possible move, b5 and then f4. So the real difference here is white doesn't really take the time to castle. And now after f4, knight c4 is almost forced, the only square for the knight at least. We can take this and castle. And in this position, lots of moves available for black yet again. A knight e8, rook b8, and even rook e8. These will be my well, suggested moves. Of course, knight e8. The plan is still, of course, to play rook b8 to attack this pawn and to free up this bishop, but also to play f5. So these are fun moves. You could counter this with f5 though, and as we can see, white is trying to conjure up an attack on the king side, and black is still focusing on the queen side, as always, almost in the Sämisch. So that's one of the most attractive notions of this opening. It's always easy to see on which side of the board you should focus your play. So very often white wants to focus the play on the king side, at least wants to prepare it with h3, f4 and so forth, whilst black wants to mobilize on the queen side and generate some activity there. So just to summarize, black's play in the Sämisch is very dynamic. You need to play fast with black. You don't have a lot of time, because once white gets his center rolling, you might be too restricted to make any active plays. So make sure to play fast and make it count with black early on. White wants to build up his center and to be patient, and of course try to squeeze black in the middle game with this massive pawn center and mobilized forces in the middle of the board. So that's the Sämisch variation against the King's Indian summed up for you very shortly from me. There are lots of more lines to cover, so if you are interested, just check out our study on Lichess. We will be posting more opening videos, of course. I will attempt to go through more lines in the King's Indian for you, so please check out those, and I'll see you soon, guys.